Did you know that the most evangelical country in Latin America was, for centuries, one of the most closed to the gospel of Jesus? Guatemala, a territory where the colonial Catholic Church had absolute power, where Mayan beliefs mixed with Roman Christianity until they became unrecognizable, where any Protestant missionary who tried to enter was expelled, imprisoned, or simply ignored. For 400 years, the door was locked, but something happened. Something nobody fully planned. Something that began with a man who died without seeing any fruit. And that ended with a president on his knees before an open Bible, governing a transformed nation. This is not the story of Catholicism in Guatemala. This is the story of the gospel of Jesus, the one that arrives late, the one that arrives alone, the one that arrives when nobody expects it, and changes everything. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to discover how a nation blocked for 4 centuries became one of the most explosive evangelical movements in the world. You're going to meet missionaries who failed gloriously, earthquakes that opened more than earth, and a civil war in the middle of a revival. If you're new to this channel, subscribe now, because this story is only the beginning of the trail. Imagine arriving in a country with a Bible in your hand and the government itself telling you not here, not with violence, with the law, with the church, with centuries of history crushing any alternative. That was Guatemala in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1524 under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, they didn't come alone. They came with priests, and from the very first day, evangelization was a state operation, not a mission of faith. The cross and the crown arrived together, and together they controlled everything. The system was simple and brutal in its efficiency. The Catholic Church had total spiritual monopoly. No competition was permitted. No dissidence was tolerated. Indigenous Mayan communities were baptized en masse, sometimes by the thousands in a single day, without catechesis, without understanding, without real conversion. The result was a hybrid religion, Catholic saints with Mayan names, ancestral rituals mixed with Mass, and a Christ that few knew personally. And so the centuries passed. Guatemala gained independence from Spain in 1821, but the power of the church did not disappear with the colony. Priests still controlled civil records, marriages, cemeteries, and education. Any Protestant idea was seen as political heresy, not just religious. The soil was not hostile by accident. It had been prepared for generations to reject any alternative to the established system. But did no missionary ever try to enter? Yes, some tried. And what happened to them reveals exactly how closed that door was. In 1824, a man named John Clark crossed the Guatemalan border with a clear mission and unbreakable faith. What he found, and what he left behind without knowing it, is the story we're going to tell in the next chapter. Subscribe. This trail is just beginning. Guatemala has just gained independence from Spain. The air smells of new freedom. And a Scottish missionary named John Clark thinks, now is the moment. If the Spanish Empire no longer controls this, maybe the door is open. Maybe. He grabs his Bible, crosses the border, and gets the shock of his life. Independence had changed the flag, but it had changed nothing else. The church was still there. The clergy was still there. and the distrust of any foreigner with Protestant ideas was still there, multiplied by centuries of doctrine that taught that reformers were heretics, enemies of God and of Guatemala. Clark was not received with stones. He was received with something worse: total indifference and institutional obstacles at every turn. He tried to preach. Doors closed. He tried to distribute Bibles. Authorities intervened. He tried to connect with local leaders. Nobody wanted the political problem of talking with him. Every week was a battle of attrition. Every month, a new wall. And Clark was not a man without faith. He was a man with faith, facing a 4-century structure. Fighting against people is not the same as fighting against systems. Years later, John Clark left Guatemala. Without a single church planted, without a single documented convert. To the world, it was an absolute failure. A missionary who went, tried, and achieved nothing. Or did he? Here comes the twist nobody expects. Before leaving, Clark did one single thing that nobody took seriously at the time. He left Bibles. A few. Hidden. In the hands of people who didn't quite know what to do with them. No follow-up. No church. No structure. Just words on pages that nobody was watching. Decades later, researchers and missionaries who arrived in Guatemala found something inexplicable. Small groups of people reading the Bible in secret. Without a pastor, without a denomination, without connection to any external movement. Just the text, just the spirit. Just what Clark had left lying on the road as if it were worth nothing. John Clark died without knowing he had planted a seed. And that seed was waiting for the right man, at the right moment, with the right tools. That man arrived in 1882. His name was Francisco Penzotti. No, wait, better than that. His name was John Hill, and he brought something Guatemala had never seen, an organized, supported mission, determined to stay. But this story has one more darker layer before reaching the light. Because between Clark and Hill, there were attempts, there were expulsions, there was a liberal government that opened a small window, and a church that did everything possible to close it again. The struggle was not only spiritual, it was political, it was economic, it was cultural. And just when it seemed the gospel would never take root in Guatemala, the earth shook, literally. February 4th, 1976. It is 3 a.m. Guatemala is asleep. And then, without warning, without signal, without anything, the earth splits in two. A 7.5 magnitude earthquake shakes the entire country in less than 39 seconds. 39 seconds. The time it takes you to read this paragraph. And in that time, 23,000 people died. 76,000 were injured. 1 million were left without homes in a single night. Entire cities disappeared from the map. Mayan villages in the mountains were buried under dust and silence. International newspapers called it the earthquake of the poor. Not because the rich didn't suffer, but because the poor lost absolutely everything. And in Guatemala, the poor were the majority. The indigenous communities of the highlands, the same ones who for centuries had been evangelized in name, but never in heart, were the most devastated. Entire families, entire communities, entire histories, erased. But here, something begins that no seismograph could measure. Within the first 72 hours, they began to arrive. Not armies, not politicians. Missionaries arrived. Evangelical volunteers arrived. Christian organizations from across the continent arrived with food, tents, medicine, and, yes, Bibles. But they didn't arrive only with resources. They arrived with presence. They stayed. They built. They wept with families. They buried the dead alongside the survivors. They did what no established religious institution had done with that speed and that human closeness. And the people saw it. In the villages of the highlands, something began to change that had no rational explanation. Mayan elders who had never heard the gospel of Jesus, the real one, the personal one, the one that transforms from within, began to hear it for the first time. Not in Latin, not from a distant pulpit, but from the mouth of someone who was sitting on the ground beside them, among the rubble, sharing the little they had. One of the most documented testimonies from that period comes from the Quiuches communities in the department of Quiché. Missionaries from the Summer Institute of Linguistics had spent years translating the Bible into indigenous languages, silent, invisible work that nobody applauded. But when the earthquake came and the volunteers arrived with those translations in hand, something ignited, the Word of God in their own language, for the first time in history, in the middle of the greatest tragedy they had ever lived. The timing was not human. The conversions were not a single event. They were a wave. Between 1976 and 1980, the number of evangelicals in Guatemala grew at a speed that sociologists didn't know how to classify. Churches were planted in villages that had never had any. Local pastors, men who weeks before had been farmers, bricklayers, fishermen, began preaching in their own communities with an authority that no seminary had given them. The revival did not come from above. It came from below, from the dust, from the rubble. But be careful, because not everything that shone in that moment was gold. The growth was real. The transformation was real. But Guatemala was also a country at war. Guerrillas in the mountains, military in the cities, a government that needed narrative, legitimacy, and control. And in that explosive context, spiritual, political, human, a figure was about to appear who would divide opinions to this day. A general, a Christian, a president, a man who came to power on his knees, and whom some never forgave for what he did afterward. Can a revival survive inside a civil war? Can the gospel grow in the middle of crossfire? Guatemala's answer is going to surprise you. There are moments in history where everything concentrates in a single figure, a man who embodies the contradictions of his era, praised by some, condemned by others, and who decades later, nobody knows exactly how to remember. That man is Efrain Rios Montt, general of the Guatemalan Army, presidential candidate in 1974. An election that many believe he won, but that was stolen from him by fraud. A man who lived the betrayal of the system from the inside, and who in the middle of that humiliation did something nobody expected from a Latin American military officer. He knelt down. He joined an evangelical church. He began to read the Bible seriously, and when his fellow soldiers looked at him strangely, he stayed there, praying, studying, transforming. Then came 1982. Guatemala was on the verge of collapse. Guerrillas in the mountains, military in the cities, civilian population trapped in the middle. On March 23rd, a coup d'etat changed everything, and Rios Montt came to power. He appeared on national television with an open Bible. He spoke of God, of morality, of national transformation. He reduced corruption at a speed nobody had seen. Evangelical churches exploded during his government. For the first time in history, a Guatemalan president spoke publicly about the gospel of Jesus. Not institutional Catholicism, but a personal and transforming faith. The evangelical movement celebrated it as a sign from heaven. But there was another story happening at the same time. In the mountains, in the places where cameras didn't reach, military operations that international organizations documented as massacres of indigenous civilians. Entire communities destroyed. The UN Commission documented serious crimes committed during that period. How to reconcile a man who opened his Bible on television with what was happening under his command? That question has no easy answer. And this channel is not here to give it to you pre-digested. Real history does not come in black and white. What is undeniable, when Rios Montt was overthrown in 1983, Guatemala was irreversibly different. Evangelicals had jumped from less than 5% to more than 20%. Pentecostal churches were filling stadiums. The country that for 400 years had kept the door closed was now exporting the gospel to the world. But this was only the first step. The trail goes deeper. Think about everything you just heard. A door closed for 400 years. A missionary who failed and left Bibles on the road without knowing he was planting the future. An earthquake that killed 23,000 people and opened what no missionary strategy had managed. And a general with a Bible, with all his contradictions, who changed the spiritual landscape of a nation. Guatemala is not a story of clean success. It is a story with dirt, with unanswered questions, and with moments of inexplicable grace. A story that forces you to accept that God works in the middle of chaos, not after it ends, always in the middle. And the most powerful lesson is this: the gospel does not need perfect conditions. John Clark saw nothing. He was expelled, ignored, forgotten. And yet, everything that came after has his invisible name in the foundations. That is what the gospel does. It works in silence. It works in the long term. And one day it blooms with a force that leaves humanity without explanation. The trail doesn't end here. Share this story because someone needs to hear it. Gracias por acompañarnos en este recorrido por la historia del cristianismo en Guatemala. Que Dios te bendiga y nos vemos en el próximo episodio.